So we're glad that you're tuning in to the first episode of Yap and Cap Economics podcast. I'm here with Mr. Cap. I'm Mr. Yap, and I'll start us off today.
Yep.
So this first episode is going to be about microeconomics, the first topic that I assume most economics classes will cover, because it goes down to it starts with the very basics of economics, supply and demand, and a lot of it is the most straightforward to understand initially, and then of course macro and global will build off of that eventually.
That's correct. For our first topic, I think we could start off easy. We could start off with negative externalities of consumption. This is a topic which is brought on fairly early in the course, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it's part of the externalities topic in general. It's one of the earlier things covered.
Mm-hmm.
Many people actually decide to write their first IA on this, their microeconomics IA. And negative externalities of consumption are perhaps the most talked about externalities in the news, and
what other externalities are there? Is it just consumption?
Well, you can have both positive and negative externalities for both production and consumption.
Oh, really? What's the difference?
Well, positive externalities are when the production or consumption of something creates unintended benefits for third parties that aren't considered by the consumer when they are consuming it.
Oh.
Let's think of some examples. For example, a positive externality of consumption.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say perhaps like school.
Mm-hmm.
When people pay for, like, governments or people, when they pay for education, specifically people themselves, they, for example, buy private education, and they're benefiting themselves, of course, by gaining an education, which they can then use in their job. But the unconsidered part of the benefit there is that there's an extra benefit towards society in making the whole economy more effective and more productive. So there's actually this extra benefit towards it, which means that more of it should be consumed than is actually consumed. It's under-consumed.
Yeah. And so I guess...
Could you give us an example of some of the other ones?
Yeah, I was thinking about, the externalities. You talked about externalities of production. I thought maybe externalities of consumption could be like, you live in an industrial area and the city hall decides to build a park in the middle. The production of this area could positively impact the others following its construction. However, we've looked at what's relevant, and we thought that negative externalities of consumption is a very relevant topic, as recycling, green energy, and topics like these are very relevant. So we thought that we could discuss one on a local scale. What do you think, Robin?
Yeah, I think that's why we chose negative externality of consumption with the example that we're going to bring in pretty soon here. It's very close. It's the most discussed one in articles, and in general the most problematic type of externality. And so it's really easy to find a topic to do for your IA on this. Mm-hmm. And it's actually, what I would recommend is looking at the 4 types of goods before listening any further. I'll explain them briefly, but I would really recommend looking at the table and visualizing this, because it really helps.
Yeah.
And the 2 things that you really need to consider with every product is the excludability and rivalry. So excludability is, can the producer exclude people from using it? For example, if you build a dam that protects a town, you cannot charge people for it, because the dam is there whether or not they want it. If 2 neighbors, one of them pays for it, one of them doesn't, you can't flood one while keeping the other, providing the service for the other. So that's non-excludable or excludable. Rivalry is whether or not the consumption of a product for one person hinders the ability of another person to consume it. For example, if there's water bottles in a store, if I buy one, there is less water left for other people to consume.
Right.
Whereas light, if there's light on the streets, me, by seeing in that light and by being in that light and benefiting from it, doesn't prevent other people from benefiting from it as well. So these 4 types of goods are really important, and you should really look at that. It's really good terminology to include in your IAs and in your essays.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned water bottles, because that's exactly what our point is right now. So I don't know if you guys have been reading the news, but the Czech government is aiming for a reduction in water bottle negative externalities due to the monetary return on consumption. Mr. Yap, do you know what can be some negative externalities of plastic bottle consumption?
Well, let me think. Perhaps the listeners can think as well and think of some. But
right.
the
Pause here, think of some, and we will
come back and we'll tell you what we thought of, and we will dive
Pause the
deeper.
video here to think, but we'll continue. So, Robin, what do you think, Mr. Yap? What are some negative externalities of plastic bottle consumption?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the waste. Of course, the plastic bottles are littered across cities, which is a negative externality, and then, of course, it needs to be cleaned up, or it can hurt even perhaps income from tourism, because less people want to visit the cities if there's litter everywhere. But perhaps more importantly with the litter is it gets into the oceans and into the environment, and it can put microplastics in the water, and it can actually hurt animals as well. When people buy plastic water bottles, they don't consider that. They consider the benefits of it being convenient, and maybe they consider the negative aspect that they'll have to find a trash can to throw it out, or that they'll have to throw it somewhere. But they don't consider the further consequences.
Yes.
So that creates a negative externality. Could you think of maybe a negative externality of producing water bottles?
Mm-hmm. Those were some good points, Robin. Mr. Yap. I guess if you really think about it, what are the negative externalities of plastic bottle production? Well, I guess there's one big outlier here. I'm thinking air pollution. With reusable water bottles,
Non-reusable?
Non-reusable, sorry. With non-reusable water bottles.
They have to be made from something, right? And those materials they're limited. It's not a sustainable practice, and transporting them across the world, that creates so many emissions.
Yeah.
And even the production itself causes quite a lot of emissions.
Yeah. So, do you think there could be any ways to reduce? When we think of negative externalities, we should be, as the government body, we should aim to reduce these negative externalities. Could you think of maybe?
Well, yeah, negative externalities mean that there is a negative effect that isn't accounted for in the free market. So what the government is trying to do is to make less people consume them. And in the Czech Republic, the specific example that we're looking at is just to not only to reduce the quantity consumed, but even directly target some of those negative externalities and reduce them directly. And I think the way that they're doing that is really clever. It's not original. European countries like Germany have done this before, and we will use this as an evaluation point later on towards the end, as just to compare and contrast their strategies with this. But the Czech Republic has now announced that they are going to introduce from 2025, I believe, a 3 crown deposit on plastic bottles. Actually, no, I'm reading this wrong. It's 4 crowns, unlike the 3 crowns that is currently on glass bottles. And the aim there is that it'll reduce the consumption while reducing the negative externality of littering. So how do you think it could reduce the consumption?
Well, I guess if you're increasing the access to bottle return locations at shops, gas stations, schools, and events, this could make returning bottles more easier and more convenient, which would in turn allow people to litter less. It's a very simple math equation, which I think can be quite effective.
Yeah, there's monetary incentive to to return water bottles and not to throw them where they don't belong. So I think that could actually reduce the externality directly.
Right.
And also the inconvenience of just having to return the bottles by itself would also motivate people to not buy single-use plastic bottles.
I think that's well said. Well, I think we're nearing towards the end here. Robin, Mr. Yap, could you think of maybe another way that they could the Czech government could aim to reduce the negative externalities of plastic bottles?
Well, of course, the microeconomics course covers several other strategies that the government can use to manipulate supply and demand. And specifically, they could introduce an indirect tax on water, perhaps, which would lower the demand. But also, they could increase government spending. For example, that's fiscal policy.
Right.
That's going to be talked about in the macro area.
Yeah. Let's not get too deep here.
And they could start spending more on recycling trash cans and all of that, but that'll be discussed later. And that's for you to learn in your economics classes.
You heard it here. You have a lot of stuff to be excited in the next episode. So this has been Mr. Yap and Mr. Cap. And
just a quick evaluation.
Yeah.
We need an evaluation at the end. We almost forgot. That's critical.
Good thinking.
In the Czech Republic, there's a 3 crown deposit on glass bottles, and 98% of glass bottles with deposits are actually returned. So we can see that the likelihood of this being successful is actually very high. And there will be regulation and incentives for people to have these return areas. And in Germany, like we said before, there was this policy introduced, and it is very, very successful. So we can expect success from it, and we can accept the negative externalities to be reduced.
All right. Thank you for stopping me there. I was going on a tangent. Well, it has been Mr. Cap and
Mr. Yap.
And thank you for listening, guys.
All right. See you at the next episode, which will be macro.
Economics.